Shiv has worked on violence in many dimensions, starting from when I remember his work 25 years ago on the violence of modern science. And he has now lived in Ahmedabad for almost a decade. So we wait to hear from you, Shiv.
Being the third man put gives you an advantage and a disadvantage. You begin with an act of envy. You wish you had said whatever they had said. So there's an act, you feel deprived. And then you realize there's a beauty in the fact that the third speaker can be a collection of footnotes. There's something fascinating about footnotes. They can be anarchic, heavy, acrimonious, even irresponsible. And I'm going to be all four. You know, I was trying to sit here and I was feeling a bit angry that Harsh changed the topic, so my original speech, which was set up like cranked up like a missile, can't be done. And I have to now present a series of possibilities. And Harsh always invites me to be respectful. And it's the duty that I'm going to resist for once. I was saying, here are two admirable people. I in fact have their values. But as an anthropologist and philosopher who spent 20 years watching violence and disasters, I mean, someone once told me, you're the laziest munshi of all social movements. What does it mean? You know, I must refer you to a book which is just coming out soon, Chandrika Parma's study of disasters. It is an Oxford University thesis, which makes a fantastic argument. She spent hours with different kinds of NGOs in the Orissa cyclone and in the Gujarat earthquake. And she came back and said, it's something stunning. Disasters today have become a site, not just for problem solving, but for philosophical exercises, for a new kind of theater about what are the categories by which we think. What are the categories by which we live out a future? And I think this is important because let's see how Harsh thinks. Here is a brilliant IAS officer who thinks the state is a solution for a certain kind of problem. And yet he begins with civilization. But what happens to the three other aspects present in your speech? Civilization, civil society, community. How does state relate to the other three? And I think this is important because I think to a certain extent one has to understand what I'm going to call the tacit constitution present in Harsh's thesis. Karl Polanyi had the idea of tacit knowledge, the inarticulate, the silences, the embodied. And to a certain extent, if you look at Harsh's diagram, and I was just sitting and diagrammatizing you, there is a sense of governance, there is a sense of rule of law, and there's a sense of electoral democracy. It's strange that actually he plays down electoral democracy, though his language of majority and minority is from electoral democracy. That is, he has to satisfy me on two categories. One, it is something that Michael Mann said, wherever societies play the language of majority and minority, they move towards extremism and genocide. They move to exterminism. Now, one of the things that Gujarat showed was, this is something more, violence of a different kind. It's exterminist. In fact, I got it from a lot of children who described this to a football match. But only one thing, instead of scoring goals, they wanted to eliminate the player. And for the first time, we saw groups not playing, they were playing zero-sum games. I think a lot of our society, you'll see people saving each other. In fact, that is one of the great stories, even of the Gujarat riot, that people did try to redeem each other. People did try to save each other. But for the first time, you're seeing terror and exterminism, which may not be so easily subject to legislation. The second thing that worries me is any problem solving always has a sense of iatrogeny. Iatrogeny, in a doctor's sense, is expert-induced illness. The doctor himself creates the illness. Now, what kind of illness does Mander create? I think you've got to ask this because there's an irony to a lot of reform. And one of the things I want to do, if I go back, is that my real response to Harsh is not a theory of reform, on which he is brilliant, but a theory of memory. If you go back to the history of the partition, that partition eventually creates two memories. The collective memory, which actually creates the modern Indian state, and individual memories, which are oral and have very little place in the imagination. Now, is Harsh catering to the oral imagination of violence or to the textual imagination of the state? Because I think it creates two different distinctive ways of problem solving. Because then you have to summon all your four categories. The civilizational, of which I think you are an embodiment. The nation state, the question of community and samaj and civil society. See, what I'm trying to say is you can't have a solution anchored only in the state. I think, and I think you are a much more complex man than your speech makes it out to be, you have to have these other four categories. Because otherwise what happens is memory is absolutely powerful in the creation of the state, because there's no such thing as a riot. Anything more than there's anything such thing as a car. A car is always a system, and a riot is a continuity of histories. It builds up on one another, it cascades into one another. So how do you create a reform which meets the problem of memory, not just the problem of justice? You know, I'm deeply committed to your notion of justice, but I'm really interested in the relation between memory and justice, because to a certain extent, the notion of reconciliation, the notion of restitution, the notion of fairness demands these other categories. So, you know, Harsh, I'm really interested in the tacit constitution, which builds your overt legislative act. The second point, as I made to you, was I think your notion of violence, if it is only about duty and dereliction of duty as control, is brilliant. But if you have extremism, if you have a certain kind of genocidal impetus, if you have a majority-minority playing zero-sum games, then just a call to administration may not be enough. And I think somewhere we are bursting the boundaries of the old discourse. Third thing is, every time I hear Harsh linearly, that is from A to Z, he's brilliant. But every time I start from Z and go to A, his notion of the social changes. And let me just tell you, it's a suspicion. When you talk about justice, violence, reform, legislation, stunning. I'm almost envious. But when you talk about rehabilitation, memory, reconstruction, what is the social you're reconstructing? Are you just returning back to the original position? Because disasters have become moments of opportunity. In many disasters, people themselves invent and create new possibilities. And where is the possibility of looking at these new possibilities, Harsh? How does the state talk to a people who in moments of disaster are extremely inventive? Jugaad even enters the world of the riot. Survival is an act of invention. And I think to a certain extent what your narrative needs is two stories. The brilliant story of a legislator thinking through an act of administration as an act of governance and as an act of rule of law. But with this wider matrix of electoral democracy, I'm all for democracy, but I'm worried about the pathologies of electoral democracy, this majority-minority thing. And you have to do one thing, and I'm saying it not as a communalist. I've tried to be one, but I found it very difficult. But as a philosopher of science, what is secularism? What is secularism in India which has so many religions? I mean, I want a more efficient secularism than the old public-private distinction. What do you do when people think in terms of religious idioms? Where does that ethic of the religion come? I mean, I've been raised in a scientific, secular family, but this bloody question of religion haunts me. I'm not comfortable with it. But somewhere I find the idiom coming again and again in creating your ethics, in creating your responses. And can secular people like you and me respond to the problematic of religion? And finally, you know, I was looking at you as a problem solver, and you always intrigue me. IAS officer, National Advisory Council, civic epistemologies. But for a problem solver, why do you simplify the solution? I mean, I thought one of the most beautiful things is you can state a problem technologically and administratively, or you can save a problem ecologically. When I read your writings, you're ecological. There's a sense of complexity. But as a problem solver, you're technical or administrative. There's a tension between the two which can be creative. But it also worries me because it creates a sense of doubt. Because to a certain extent, the question of memory comes again when we were talking. What is second generation memory of a rat? Or a third generation memory of a rat? And I'll just give you one example. I work a lot on environment, on pollution. And I was meeting a man who makes these effluent treatment plants. And we suddenly discovered that he wanted to talk about the partition. And he told us this beautiful story of how he was in the train, that legendary train from Pakistan, and how he went to Daryaganj and found dead bodies. And after the 6th interview, you realized that this guy was 4 years old when the partition took place. He had taken on the memory of his father. He had telescoped those memories. Now, when you have citizens with this kind of memory, what is law? What is legislation? And I'm not doing it as a critique. I think somewhere I'm trying to sort of build a devil's advocacy against my secular self. And I want to understand that. Because somewhere I'm troubled, spending 10 years in Gujarat where I went to write a book on Narendra Modi. And it comes down to the fact that of the 240 students I teach, I must be a bad teacher, 237 still believe that Modi did the right thing. Of the 3 abstentions, 1 was a Muslim, and the two of them saw me glaring at them. But can we think of some more permanent kind of resistance or ethics? Can we use popular culture in a different way? Which is a problem I think you raised beautifully. But a popular culture which cuts in different directions. So you might be saying at one level I'm unfair because all I have is questions. But I think that's the right of a footnote. When you have the thesis, all I have is doubt. Thank you.